So today we're going to talk about the Panasonic Lumix S5 Mark II. It's the latest iteration in the L-mount series. We're going to get into video recording modes. We're going to do a vlogging test and of course discuss the new phase detect autofocus system. So with all that out of the way, let's get started. So if you're familiar with this channel, I've covered Panasonic cameras a lot in the past, especially the L-mount series like the S1 and the S5, both of which I've owned. And I even garnered quite a bit of criticism for the video where I talked about selling my S1. The big deal breaker for me from the S1 was the lack of a competent autofocus system that didn't have background pulsing and that could provide consistent results. Now with the S5 Mark II, over the course of this video, I'll be assessing the quality of the autofocus, the consistency, and if Panasonic did indeed counteract all that background pulsing with this new phase detect system. So let's get to a vlogging test. So vlogging now on the S5 Mark II. I've got stabilization on. And the lens I'm using is the 24-70 f2.8. It's not the lens I wanted, which was the 24mm f1.8. If you're looking to vlog using this camera, I would strongly recommend the 24mm instead of this lens or even the 18mm. How's the stabilization looking? How's the autofocus looking? The picture profile I'm using is Cine D2. I've always been a fan of that picture profile. It's a very nice sort of Rec 709 out-the-box looking image. Skin tones look good with it. And if you're familiar with the first S5, the stabilization on that camera, to me at least, was a huge disappointment, especially coming from the S1. So just based on a really quick glance here and not studying it too much, stabilization looks greatly improved from the S5. So after reviewing the vlog footage, I've concluded the stabilization is much better and it's a huge upgrade from the S5 Mark I. Overall, Panasonic is known for having the best stabilization in cameras, and this goes back to the Micro Four Thirds systems, the GH series, and especially with cameras like the S1 and the S1H. The stabilization was very dependable and very strong. However, with the S5 Mark I, oftentimes the stabilization can be a bit flimsy. It's not as dependable, so that's why this is a welcome addition, having the Mark II be as consistent as it is. And you can take a look here at an additional test I did with Stephanie, just following her around using E-stabilization in the first part and then using E-stabilization with the boost in the second part, and you can notice the difference. Now in terms of the autofocus, I'm always very hesitant to make a conclusion about the autofocus, especially on Panasonic cameras. And the reason being is that time and time again, Panasonic has promised improved autofocus. This has been kind of the running joke with Panasonic, dating back to even so far as the S1, the S5. Oftentimes there would be firmware updates that would promise a certain incremental improvement in autofocus, but oftentimes even after updating the camera to the latest firmware version, the autofocus improvement would be very slight, if anything at all, and it never really eliminated the background pulsing. And that's one of the reasons why I'm filming this right now on the S5 Mark II, because I want to see how this works in a talking head environment. I'm not really doing any movement. What I'm watching for is, if you see that vintage camera behind me, I'm really hoping that doesn't jump into focus all of a sudden. If I was using an S5 Mark I, that would have already happened. But it appears to be consistent. Very nice. If there's any background pulsing, feel free to leave it in the comments below. And speaking of autofocus, I performed an additional test with Stephanie. This time I have her position behind a wall, and I want to see the responsiveness and the consistency of the autofocus. So let's take a look. The phase detect is not the only new feature in the camera, so I want to get to additional features. Now, the first thing I want to cover are recording modes. Essentially, when I first looked at the Mark II spec sheet, it looked a lot like the Panasonic S5 Mark I after firmware 2.0, in that open gate 6K was an option, as were the higher quality bitrate codecs. So in a lot of ways, the S5 Mark II is a maxed out S5 Mark I, although with unlimited recording options and of course this new autofocus system. Now, one feature I'm a huge fan of in the Mark II is the fact that you can toggle between the base ISOs. And if you're familiar with Sony and Canon, usually the ability to toggle between base ISO levels is something that's more of a cinematic feature in cameras, usually found in things such as the FX6, the FX9. Now, in addition to video improvements to the S5, there's also photo improvements. And to better demonstrate this, I took two models to two different environments to show what this camera is really capable of. So let's take a look. After shooting with Lena and Stephanie, I found that the camera was capable of quite a bit, both in outdoors and studio environment. I really enjoy the color science of the Panasonic series, especially after the S5. I couldn't help but notice that the colors seem to get a little bit better in camera. Now, the S5 Mark II is admittedly not as fast as other cameras like, say, the Alpha 1, although to compare the two, I think is a pretty bad comparison given that they're both at two very different price points. The S5 Mark II is fast, however. It's responsive. The autofocus is still pretty solid. I mean, it feels as though the photo autofocus is pretty much the same in terms of quality and consistency as the Mark I. I'm very happy to see full-size HDMI make an appearance on this camera. I worked with micro HDMI a lot, did not enjoy it, as I'm sure many of you didn't. The cable is always breaking off, coming out loose. Full-size HDMI is the way to be, so that's another great addition to this camera. My experience overall with the S5 Mark II has been very positive. I feel as though in every field it's been an improvement. The only area where I feel as though it's been a slight regression is the battery life. That's taken a little bit of a haircut. And I double checked, it turns out that the Mark I has better battery life than the Mark II. So is this camera right for you and your uses? Well, that entirely depends on where you're coming from. If you're already invested heavily into the L-mount system, this is the best L-mount camera available in my estimation. It's essentially all upswing from the S5 Mark I. If, however, you're invested in Sony or Canon already or another manufacturer, or maybe you're in the market for your very first camera, this is still something to look into. If 4K 60p with APS-C crop is not a deal breaker, this might be the camera for you. It pretty much does everything that I would hope it would do, minus that, and maybe also autofocus in slow motion. Everything else, though, about this camera is great. I mean, everything from the full-size HDMI, the toggable dual-base ISOs, the unlimited recording times, the robust video recording options, the improved stabilization, and of course, phase detect autofocus. So anyway, that's all for now. And as always, if you found this video helpful or insightful, give a big thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, comment below, let me know what you think, and I'll see you in the next one.